April 24th, 1969. The North Vietnamese Army had put the highest bounty of the entire Vietnam War on a single American sergeant, not to kill him, but to take him alive. So if every NVA commander from Hanoi South had his face and his description and orders to bring him in, how does a man like that just disappear? 12,000 tons of supplies were moving south through that jungle every single month. The canopy above the border between Laos and South Vietnam was so thick, the sunlight hit the ground in thin, broken pieces, if it hit at all. Dense green pressing in from every side, the sound of insects and water, and nothing else. If you flew over it in a helicopter at 500 feet, you might pass the whole thing and see nothing worth worrying about at all. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a road. It was a system, a living thing. Thousands of people moved through it at any given moment, day and night, in shifts that never stopped. Porters bent double under loads of 300 pounds. Bicycles fitted with wooden frames to carry far more than any bicycle was ever built to carry. Anti-aircraft guns tucked so deep under the canopy that American pilots had almost no warning before the first rounds came up. The trail was not a line on a map. It was a city that moved, that breathed, that repaired itself while you watched. The United States had been trying to kill it for years. By 1967, American aircraft had dropped more tonnage on Southeast Asia than all Allied forces had dropped in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. Read that again. More bombs than the whole Pacific War combined, and the trail kept moving. Work teams repaired a destroyed section within hours. A washed-out crossing was replaced 300 meters further along before the dust from the last strike had even settled. Bombing a supply network into submission does not work when the network is made of people who simply walk around the holes. Nearly 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam by 1967. The firepower behind them was the largest ever assembled. The strategy was clear, the resources were real, and the North Vietnamese army was still getting what it needed, moving it where it needed to go, fighting on its own terms and its own schedule. Something had to change. What changed was a unit, a very small one that officially did not exist. MACV-SOG stood for Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. The name was chosen to sound like paperwork, like something so forgettable that nobody with clearance or without it would look twice. It worked. For years, almost no one outside the very highest levels of classified access knew what it actually was. The unit ran cross-border missions into Laos, into Cambodia, and at times into North Vietnam itself. These were places where American forces were officially not present. So officially, the missions were not happening either. The teams were tiny. 2 or 3 Americans paired with 8 to 10 indigenous fighters, mostly Montagnard tribesmen, and Nung mercenaries who knew the terrain and who had their own reasons to fight. They carried what they could and nothing more. Their job was to go where no one else could go, find what no one else could see, and come back out. When they located a target worth more than a written report, a hatchet force followed, a small strike element, 6 to 10 men. They hit the target and they left. The casualty rate was the highest of any unit in the Vietnam War. The men who joined knew this. They joined anyway. One of them was Sergeant First Class Jerry Shriver from Defuniak Springs, Florida. Nobody who served with him would have picked him out of a lineup as the most dangerous man in the theater. He was not built like a recruitment poster. He was not loud. He did not fill a room. He was slight, quiet, and unremarkable in the way that certain people are unremarkable right up until the moment they are not. He arrived in Vietnam in 1966 and almost immediately stopped making sense to the people around him in the best possible way. Other soldiers went to the mess hall. Shriver ate with the Montagnard fighters. Other men took the bunk when a bunk was available. He slept on the ground. He learned to speak with the indigenous men he operated alongside, not from a course or a phrase book, but by sitting with them until the words came naturally and they stopped correcting him. They accepted him in a way that took most American soldiers years to earn, and some never did. He was not performing their culture. He had simply decided that the distance most Americans kept was a waste of time he did not have. He kept a German Shepherd at base. The dog's name, according to those who were there, was Klaus, not a mascot, something closer than that. In a life that moved between missions nobody could discuss and places that officially did not exist, Klaus was the one thing that was simply and quietly his. He carried more weapons than most men thought practical: revolvers, a sawn-off shotgun, a submachine gun. Not for show. Because he had worked out, through experience, exactly what he needed in the specific situations he put himself in, and he planned accordingly. His fellow SOG operators described him the same way across dozens of interviews over the years. Brave past the point most men stop. Strange in a way that was hard to name. The best they had ever seen. A man who seemed genuinely to belong in the field more than anywhere else on Earth. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Fleming, a Medal of Honor recipient who flew alongside Shriver on several missions, called him simply this: the quintessential warrior loner. But Shriver had understood something about this war that the generals had not. The NVA expected Americans to fight like Americans. Loud. With air support built in from the start. With extraction protocols woven into every step they took. With radios checking in on schedule, helicopters never more than 20 minutes out, and the full weight of a modern military pressing forward from behind. That pattern was predictable. The enemy had studied it. They had built their entire defensive posture around it. Shriver decided not to give them that pattern. He moved the way the NVA moved, quiet, patient. On their schedule, not his own. He went where they went and appeared when and where they did not expect anyone to appear. His teams carried captured NVA weapons alongside American ones, so that, in a firefight, at distance, the sound of the contact did not announce who was firing. He called false grid coordinates into the radio before real insertions so that enemy signals teams spent the night monitoring the wrong territory. He inserted at night and moved to a secondary position before dawn, so that even if the landing zone had been watched, his real starting point was already somewhere else. You cannot hunt what you cannot find. And he had made himself, as much as any American soldier in that war ever managed, genuinely unfindable. The NVA noticed. They always notice what costs them enough. And somewhere in a command post that no American was supposed to know existed, someone placed a bounty on one sergeant's head. Not the highest-ranking American in the theater, not a general, not a senior officer of any kind. One sergeant. They wanted him alive. They never got him. Not yet. The first thing Shriver understood was that a man moving through the terrain leaves signs. Every conventional American unit he had ever observed left too many of them. Trash buried too shallow. Boot prints at regular intervals in soft ground near water. The smell of American soap and American food drifting through air that had no experience of either. The NVA did not need satellites or aircraft to locate a patrol. They needed to wait, and the patrol would announce itself. So, Shriver stopped announcing himself. His teams moved at night when the canopy was at its darkest, and the temperature dropped enough that the air felt different on your skin. They moved in single file, each man close enough to the one ahead to reach out and touch his shoulder in the black. A gap of 10 feet in triple canopy at midnight meant losing the man completely. They moved slowly. 1 kilometer per hour in dense terrain was not failure. It was discipline. It was the only pace that produced the silence the mission required. Before any insertion, Shriver did something that looked almost paranoid until you understood the reason behind it. He called in a set of coordinates. Then he went somewhere else entirely. The coordinates he radioed were real grid references, real terrain. They were simply not where his team was going. NVA signals intelligence units monitored American radio traffic constantly. If they heard a grid reference, they sent men there. Shriver sent them to empty undergrowth and walked in through the back door while those men were still waiting. He and his team carried a mix of weapons, American rifles and pistols alongside captured NVA rifles, AK-47s taken from dead enemy soldiers and kept in working condition. The reason was simple. In a firefight at distance, American M16s and NVA AK-47s produced different sounds. Any NVA soldier within earshot of an M16 knew he was hearing an American. Shriver's team sounded like the dark fighting itself. At distance, in the confusion of a contact, those extra seconds of uncertainty were the difference between getting out and not getting out. He went in with 10 men at most. 2 Americans and 8 indigenous fighters, Montagnard tribesmen, and Nung soldiers who moved through the canopy the same way he did, without noise, without waste, without the habits that got men killed. He did not manage them, he operated with them. There is a difference that every man on those teams understood. and that no training manual ever fully captured. The missions fell into two types. The first was reconnaissance, pure information gathering deep inside Laos or Cambodia, mapping what was there, base camp locations, trail junctions, supply cache sites. The team moved in, recorded what it found, and got out without being seen. No shots fired, no trace left. The second type was the hatchet force mission. When a recon team had identified a target, Shriver's element went in to hit it, not to destroy it with the weight of a battalion, but to strike it precisely, cause maximum disruption, and leave before the NVA could organize a response. A fuel cache deep in Cambodia, a communications relay site hidden under the canopy, a supply hub where the trail network branched into three directions. Go in fast, hit hard, get out clean. The results accumulated quietly through 1967 and into 1968. Base camps disrupted, supply lines rerouted, trail nodes forced offline for days at a time. The damage was real, but it was also something harder to measure. It was uncertainty. Every NVA commander in the region began to feel that the territory they thought they owned was not entirely theirs. Something was moving through it that did not follow the rules they had written. At COS Van, the NVA's Southern Command headquarters buried deep inside Cambodia, this pattern had not gone unnoticed. Reports were coming in from across southern Laos and northeastern Cambodia, a small American-led element moving like no American unit they had encountered before, hitting targets that should have been safe and vanishing before a response could be mounted. QOSVN began building a file, a description, a pattern, and at some point, they attached a price to the name they had pieced together. The bounty was $10,000, announced by Radio Hanoi. In 1967 dollars, that was roughly $85,000 in today's money. For a country where a common NVA soldier earned the equivalent of a few US dollars each month, the sum represented years of wages. The NVA did not issue bounties like this for inconveniences. They issued them for problems that could not be solved any other way. Radio Hanoi went further than a price. The station began mentioning Shriver by name in propaganda broadcasts, describing his missions, giving him a nickname that was meant to frighten the people listening. They called him Mad Dog. It had the opposite effect. Among his fellow soldiers, the name stuck as a badge. Among the NVA commanders hunting him, it meant something else, proof that one American was costing them enough to spend airtime on. The order attached to the bounty was specific. Shriver was to be taken alive. Dead, he was one less soldier. Alive, he was a window into SOG operations, American knowledge of the trail network, and the methods that had made one small team so difficult to find and so costly to ignore. They wanted what was in his head more than they wanted him gone. The problem was that no unit they sent could find him. Back inside the SOG compound, not everyone was comfortable with what Shriver was doing. Conventional Army officers who crossed paths with his operations found his methods irregular. He did not always file the paperwork in the way the Army liked paperwork filed. He operated with a level of personal autonomy that sat outside normal command structures. Requests were made, more than once, to rotate him back to a stateside assignment, to give him rest, to fold him back into something that could be supervised in the usual ways. These requests did not succeed. The men at the top of the SOG command structure looked at the results and made a straightforward calculation. The base camps hit, the intelligence produced, the disruption to the trail network that no air campaign had been able to match per unit cost. His methods were irregular, his results were not. When the man the enemy has named, priced, and broadcast across a propaganda radio station asks to stay in the field, the answer is simple: you let him stay. And so, he stayed. The NVA kept looking, and somewhere in Cambodia, a camp sat in the dark that did not yet know he was coming. By 1968, Shriver had been running missions into denied territory for long enough that the NVA had built an entire defensive response around him without ever managing to stop him. The accounts of the men who served alongside him point consistently toward a figure above 50 confirmed insertions. 50 missions into territory that officially did not belong to them, into countries where they officially were not present, against an enemy that was actively hunting them every time they went in. The damage those missions produced was not always visible from above. A destroyed fuel cache did not make the newspapers. A communications relay taken offline did not generate a press briefing. What it generated was a change in how the NVA used that section of the trail, which rerouted traffic, created new choke points, and made other parts of the network more exposed. One small team in the right place at the right moment did not have to win a battle to effect a war. It had to make the enemy uncertain, and Shriver had made an enormous section of the NVA's rear area profoundly and persistently uncertain. That uncertainty had a real cost. Units that should have been moving supplies spent hours searching undergrowth that turned out to be empty. Guard schedules were doubled at base camps that had never needed heavy security. Commanders who had trusted the canopy to hide them now kept men awake through the night, burning energy on a threat they could not locate well enough to plan against. The trail still moved, but it moved with a new weight pressing down on it. Then came Cambodia, 1968, and a mission that said everything about who Shriver was. The team inserted after dark. 6 men, Shriver and 1 other American, and 4 Montagnard fighters who moved through the canopy as though it had grown around them specifically. They were deep inside Cambodia, 40 miles from the nearest American fire base, in country that no official map showed any American presence in. The air was wet and heavy the way it is before dawn, thick enough that every breath felt like work. Above them, complete darkness. No sky, no stars, nothing but the sounds of the terrain and the dark pressing in, tight around them. On the second day, they found something that changed the mission entirely. It was not a patrol base. It was not a small cache. It was a full logistics camp built into the undergrowth with the settled confidence of a commander who believed he was completely safe. Supply crates stacked in rows between the trees, fuel drums, dozens of them, grouped and covered with cut branches, a generator running somewhere out of sight, its low hum carrying through 200 meters of vegetation. Cooking fires shielded from the air, but visible at ground level, the smell of food reaching the 6 men lying flat in the dark, 300 to 500 NVA soldiers. This was not a target, it was a city. Standard procedure was clear: pull back, exfiltrate, radio the coordinates, and let the air assets do the rest. 6 men do not attack 500. That is not courage, that is arithmetic. Shriver looked at the fuel drums and made a different calculation. What came next took less than 4 minutes. The team hit the fuel depot and started moving immediately. The first explosion threw orange light up through the canopy in every direction, painting the trees in fire and shadow. Then the secondary blasts began, each one louder than the last. Each one pushed a wall of pressure through the air that hit you in the chest before it reached your ears. The camp went from silence to chaos between one breath and the next. Men running, voices shouting orders that nobody was following because nobody knew which direction the strike had come from or how large the force behind it was. The team was already gone. They moved through routes memorized on the way in, using the noise of the explosions as cover for their movement. The extraction call went out. Every man came out. The NVA report filed afterward estimated the attacking force at a size that would have required the U.S. military to explain why it had sent a company of soldiers into territory it was not officially operating in. The actual number was 6 men and 1 sergeant who had decided the arithmetic was open to debate. The North Vietnamese army had put the highest bounty of the entire war on this man, $10,000. They had been trying to take him for years. 6 men had just hit their battalion camp and vanished before anyone could respond. They were not catching him, not tonight, not ever. That is what the bounty was for. And that is precisely why, after everything they had spent, they still could not collect it. The men who served alongside Shriver come back to 2 things when they talk about him. They talk about what he could do in the field, and then they talk about something harder to put into words. They talk about how he was with the Montagnard fighters, how he sat with them in the evenings and ate what they ate and learned the words they used until they stopped treating him like a visitor, how he had been welcomed into ceremonies that most outsiders were never shown, how the men he fought beside followed him, not because the army had ordered it, but because somewhere in the years of shared missions and shared dark, he had stopped being someone passing through their world and had become part of it. They talk about Klaus waiting at base when Shriver came back from the missions nobody could ask him about. Not a mascot, something closer than that. The one constant in a life that had no other constants. By his 3rd tour, people who knew him noticed he was carrying something heavier than the weapons. He had started drinking. He was sleeping badly. He was quieter than before, if that was even possible. A man who had lived inside the war so long that the edges between who he was out there and who he was back here had started to blur. 27 years old and shaped by something most people never see once. He was not a man who needed saving from the war. He was not counting days until he could go home. He had found, in the middle of the worst thing a human being can be part of, the only place he had ever felt fully himself. That is not a flattering thing to say about a person. It is not simple. It is simply true. If you have never heard of MACV-SOG before this video, there is a reason for that. The unit was classified for decades, and the men who served in it came home carrying stories they were not permitted to tell. There are more of those stories on this channel. Hit subscribe so you do not miss them. They adjusted the trail security across every sector where his teams had been active. They positioned units at insertion points he had used before. They briefed local commanders on his description and the profile years of failure had built. They prepared for the next mission the same way they always prepared, which meant they were always wrong. Shriver did not run the same operation twice. He did not give a pattern to study. The NVA had spent years building a predictive model of his movements. There was nothing to predict. There was only the next mission, the next dark, and a man they would never find in the same place twice. The bounty still stood. Shriver was still in the field. Kozvin had circulated his description with the order to bring him in alive, and they were no closer to collecting. No other individual American soldier in that war had been the subject of that kind of sustained, specific, costly pursuit, and no other American had made that pursuit look quite so futile. Something would have to give eventually. The canopy takes everything in the end. It always does. April 24th, 1969, Cambodia, the Fishhook area, a section of jungle that held, somewhere inside it, the COSVN, the nerve center of the NVA's entire southern operation. The mission was a hatchet force strike. Intelligence suggested a viable target. The orders were clean and the plan was straightforward. Shriver had 3 weeks left on his third tour. 3 weeks and he would rotate home, or whatever home meant for a man whose life had been built entirely around this. He went in after dark the way he always did. The team moved through the night, through the wet air, and the silence that Shriver had spent years learning how to inhabit. Nothing in the insertion suggested that this time was different from any other. Then they made contact, and the contact was different from any other. The NVA was there in battalion strength, at minimum 300 men, far beyond anything the intelligence had indicated. Not a lightly held position, a full defensive structure, deep and reinforced, with the kind of firepower that turned a hatchet force strike into a straight fight for survival. The radio calls went out immediately. The team was in contact, and the situation was getting worse fast. Extraction was requested, and the clock started on how long it would take to arrive. What happened in the minutes that followed is recorded in the accounts of the men who survived. Those accounts agree on one detail above every other. The last time anyone saw Sergeant First Class Jerry Shriver, he was moving toward the enemy, not pulling back to the extraction point, not withdrawing to cover, moving forward into the contact, alone, firing. The canopy closed around him. Nobody saw him fall. Nobody saw what happened after. The rest of the hatchet force got out. Shriver and 5 of his Montagnard soldiers did not come with them. Searches were conducted. The contact area was examined from the air and on the ground where it was possible to enter. Nothing was found, no body, no sign. The terrain that Shriver had moved through for 3 years, as though it belonged to him, gave nothing back. He was listed as missing in action. He was later declared presumed killed in action. Those 2 words, presumed, carry a specific weight. They mean the evidence points one way, but the case is not fully closed. They mean the Army has made a decision in the absence of proof, because the alternative is to leave a name in permanent suspension, which helps no one. He was 27 years old. He had $1 and some change in his bank account. He left behind clothes, and he left behind a silk smoking jacket that his fellow operators hung in the camp club, with a handwritten inscription underneath it, in memory of Sergeant First Class Jerry M. Shriver. They kept it there long after the war ended, because some men leave a shape in a room that does not fill in. What came next arrived from an unexpected direction. For years after the war, researchers and the families of the missing examined North Vietnamese records, propaganda documents, prisoner logs, and after-action reports. They found nothing about Shriver, The NVA had every reason to announce the capture of the American they had hunted for years at the highest price in the war. His capture would have been a statement. His questioning would have been valuable. Parading the man Radio Hanoi had named and priced across 50 missions would have told the world something about the limits of American special operations. They never said a word. There are two ways to read that silence. The first is that he died in the contact on April 24, 1969, either from wounds or in the fighting itself, and the NVA recovered no one worth reporting. The second is darker and cannot be ruled out. Some of the men who were there believed he was still alive when the extraction left. If the NVA reached him before his wounds took him, they had what they had spent years and $10,000 trying to get. And for reasons that have never been explained, they kept it quiet, and kept him wherever they kept him, and never brought him home through any of the prisoner exchange processes that followed the war. He was never brought home. No exchange produced him, no remains were ever identified, no document surfaced in any archive. His name is on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Panel 26W, row 41. It is one of more than 58,000 names on that black granite wall, each one a gap that never closed. His name does not say how he died. It says when he was last confirmed alive. That is the most honest thing the record can offer. For years after the war, the men who served in MACV-SOG could not talk about what they had done. Classified. All of it. Veterans came home carrying the weight of a war within a war, and the world outside had no framework for what they had been part of. They could not explain it. They were not permitted to try. Declassification began in the 1990s. John Plaster, who had himself run missions into the same denied territory and understood what the work had cost, wrote the history that gave the unit a record that could finally be read. He described Shriver not as a footnote but as a standard, the man against whom other performances were measured. Decades after the war ended, among the men who had served in that unit, Shriver's name still carried one specific meaning: what was possible when a man found the place that fit him and refused to leave. Shriver was posthumously promoted to Master Sergeant. He received no Medal of Honor, no public recognition that could have acknowledged operations in places the United States had officially never sent anyone. The men who deserved the most, for the work that cost the most, received the least, because the work itself could not be named. The NVA put the highest bounty of the war on one American sergeant. They announced it on the radio. They circulated his description to every commander in the operational theater. They issued the order to bring him back alive. They directed every resource they had toward the problem, and for 3 years they could not close it while he was in the field and moving and choosing where to be. On April 24, 1969, they may have finally gotten what they paid for, or they may not. The canopy may have simply kept him, the way it keeps everything eventually, on its own terms and nobody else's. This story began with 2 words: not yet. The answer to whether the NVA ever changed that has not been confirmed in more than 50 years. He is still listed as unaccounted for. The bounty was never collected, but after more than 50 years of silence, nobody is entirely sure what that means.